The camera moved slowly across the devastated landscape, recording every detail of environmental destruction. Marcus Chen had been documenting abandoned oil fields for 3 years, but this one in northern Montana was particularly bad. Pools of crude oil sat stagnant in forgotten pits, their rainbow sheens reflecting the October sun. The company had walked away decades ago, leaving nature to deal with their mess. He'd been filming for 2 hours when he heard it. At first, Marcus thought it was wind moving through the rusted derricks. He kept filming. Then he heard again, a wet, labored sound that made him lower his camera. He stood perfectly still, listening. There it was again, coming from a pit 20 yards to his left. Marcus approached carefully. These old pits could have unstable edges that crumbled without warning. He tested each step before putting his full weight down. The breathing sound grew louder. When he reached the edge and looked down, his stomach turned. A shape lay in the crude oil, so completely covered that Marcus couldn't immediately identify what he was looking at. Then he saw the slight rise and fall of breathing. Whatever it was still alive. He dropped to his knees, trying to make sense of the form. That's when he saw the paw, small, with claws that told him this was a bear cub. The cub wasn't moving except for those shallow breaths. Marcus knew he had minutes, maybe less. He looked around frantically for something to help him reach down into the pit. An old wooden plank lay nearby. He tested it. Solid enough. Using it as a bridge, he lowered himself partially into the pit, his boots sinking into the oily mud at the edge. The smell was overwhelming. Marcus fought not to gag as he reached for the cub. His hands slipped on the oil-soaked fur. The cub didn't react to his touch. Marcus adjusted his grip, getting his arms under the small body. The cub was heavier than expected, weighted down with oil. He lifted, his boots sliding in the muck. For a terrifying moment, he thought they'd both fall back into the pit. Then his foot found solid ground, and he pulled them both onto safe earth. The cub lay limp in his arms. Marcus could feel the rapid, weak heartbeat through the oil-matted fur. Those shallow breaths continued, but the cub's eyes remained closed. Marcus ran to his truck, carrying the cub like a baby. He'd packed old towels for cleaning his equipment. He grabbed them all. The first towel came away black. So did the second. By the fifth towel, patches of brown fur began to show through. Marcus worked methodically, cleaning the cub's face first. The oil had sealed the cub's eyes shut. He carefully wiped them clean with a corner of towel dipped in his water bottle. When those eyes finally opened, dark brown and unfocused, Marcus felt something shift in his chest. The cub looked at him without fear, too exhausted for anything but trust. Marcus kept working, towel after towel, water bottle after water bottle. He had a case of water in his truck for these long documentation days. He used all of it. The cub was female, Marcus realized as he worked. Maybe 4 months old, based on her size. Old enough to have been walking with her mother, learning to forage. Young enough that she couldn't have survived long on her own. He wondered how long she'd been in that pit. Hours certainly. Maybe since yesterday. As he cleaned her, the cub began to shiver. That was good, Marcus told himself. Her body was trying to regulate temperature again. He wrapped her in his jacket and carried her to the truck's cab. The heater would help. He turned it on full blast and positioned the cub on the passenger seat, still wrapped in his jacket. Marcus knew he needed to get her to help, but the nearest wildlife rehabilitation center was 3 hours away. He called them from his satellite phone. The woman who answered, Sarah, stayed calm as Marcus described what he'd found. She needs fluids immediately, Sarah said. Do you have any supplies with you? Marcus didn't. He was 40 minutes from the nearest town. Sarah walked him through what to do until he could get supplies. Keep her warm. Don't try to give her water. She might aspirate in her weakened state. Watch her breathing. If it became more labored, he needed to clear her airways again. The drive to town felt endless. The cub lay still on the passenger seat, her breathing the only sign of life. Marcus talked to her the entire way. Nonsense mostly. Just wanted her to hear a voice. You're going to be okay, he said over and over. I've got you. The general store in Coalfield had basic supplies. Marcus bought bottled water with electrolytes, honey, and a small bottle meant for human babies. The elderly woman at the counter looked at his oil-stained clothes with concern. When Marcus explained, she disappeared into the back and returned with an old heating pad. "It still works," she said, refusing his money for it. In the parking lot, Marcus mixed a solution of water and honey as Sarah had instructed. The cub was conscious but weak. He held her head and slowly dripped the mixture into the corner of her mouth. At first, nothing happened. Then she swallowed. Marcus felt like cheering. Drop by drop, she took in the fluid. The 3-hour drive to the rehabilitation center stretched on. Marcus stopped every 30 minutes to give the cub more fluid. Each time, she seemed a little stronger. By the third stop, she was lifting her head on her own. By the fourth, her eyes tracked his movements. Sarah was waiting when Marcus pulled up to the rehabilitation center. She took one look at the cub and rushed her inside. Marcus followed, not ready to leave her yet. He watched as Sarah and her team went to work, checking vital signs, starting in 4, examining for injuries beyond the oil exposure. "She's lucky," Sarah said an hour later. "No broken bones. Her lungs sound relatively clear. She didn't inhale much oil. But she's severely dehydrated and malnourished. She's been on her own for at least a week." A week. The cub had survived a week alone before falling into that pit. Marcus thought about her mother. What might have happened? Car strike, most likely. Or illegal hunting. The result was the same. An orphan cub who wouldn't have survived winter. "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "We stabilize her. Clean the rest of the oil from her fur. It'll take multiple washings over several days. Get her eating solid food again. Then," Sarah paused. "Then we need to find a placement for her. She's too young to survive on her own, and she can't be taught what she needs to know without a mother." Marcus visited the next day. The cub was in a small enclosure, still weak but alert. She recognized him immediately, making a soft huffing sound. Sarah was surprised. She hasn't responded to anyone else like that. Over the next week, Marcus came every day. He had other oil fields to document, but he couldn't leave. Not yet. Each day the cub grew stronger. Sarah's team had cleaned all the oil from her fur, revealing a beautiful brown coat with lighter tips. She began eating solid food, fish and berries, and specially formulated bear food. But there was a problem. The cub had become attached to Marcus in a way that concerned Sarah. She would only eat if he was present. She became agitated when he left. This wasn't normal or healthy for a wild bear. "She's imprinted," Sarah explained. "It sometimes happens when cubs lose their mother's young and a human intervenes. She sees you as her protector." This was bad news for release. A bear that sought out humans was a dead bear. They couldn't release her into the wild if she would approach people. Sarah began reaching out to zoos and sanctuaries, but spaces for bears were limited and usually reserved for cubs that could be released. 2 weeks passed. The cub, Marcus had started calling her Luna because she'd been most active during the evening hours, was thriving physically. She gained weight. Her coat was glossy. She played with enrichment toys Sarah provided. But the attachment to Marcus remained strong. Then something unexpected happened. Marcus was sitting outside Luna's enclosure, reading documentation about oil field cleanup procedures, when Sarah came running. "We just got a call from Fish and Wildlife. A female bear has been hanging around the oil fields where you found Luna. She's agitated, searching for something." Marcus's heart raced. Her mother. Maybe. Female bears have been known to search for lost cubs for weeks. If it's her. Sarah trailed off. The chances were slim. Even if it was Luna's mother, reuniting them after this long would be dangerous. The mother might reject Luna, especially with human scent all over her. But they had to try. Fish and Wildlife set up a temporary enclosure near the oil fields, in an area where the female bear had been spotted multiple times. The plan was to bring Luna there in a transport crate, let the bears see and smell each other through the barriers. If the female showed interest rather than aggression, they could attempt a reunion. Marcus insisted on coming. He knew it was probably goodbye either way. Either Luna would be reunited with her mother, or she'd have to go to his sanctuary. But he needed to be there. They set up before dawn. Luna was in her transport crate, calm but alert. Marcus stayed back, out of sight but close enough to watch. They'd placed the crate where the female bear would find it on her regular searching route. They waited. At 7 in the morning, she appeared. A large brown bear, thin from weeks of searching and not eating properly. She moved slowly through the area, nose to the ground. Then she stopped. Her head came up. She'd caught Luna's scent. The female bear approached the crate carefully. Luna, who had been quiet, suddenly began making sounds Marcus had never heard, soft, plaintive calls. The mother bear responded with low huffs. She circled the crate, smelling every inch. Then she did something that made everyone hold their breath. She lay down next to the crate. For 3 hours, the mother bear stayed beside the crate. She made soft sounds. Luna responded. They were talking, Sarah whispered to Marcus. Mothers and cubs have unique vocal signatures. They were recognizing each other. Fish and Wildlife made the decision to open the crate. The door swung open. Luna didn't rush out. She emerged slowly, cautiously. The mother bear stood. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Luna made a specific sound, a huffing call that Sarah later said was exclusive to mother-cub pairs. The mother bear responded immediately. Luna ran to her, and the mother bear enveloped her cub with her body, smelling her all over, licking her face. Marcus found himself crying. But the reunion was just the beginning. Luna was weak compared to a cub that had been with its mother all along. She needed to relearn wild behaviors. Fish and Wildlife decided to monitor them, providing supplemental food to help the mother bear's condition improve while she retaught Luna's survival skills. Marcus extended his documentation project by a month. He told himself it was to record the environmental damage more thoroughly. But really, he wanted to make sure Luna and her mother were okay. He saw them twice more from a distance. The mother was gaining weight. Luna was following her, learning to forage, to fish in the streams that weren't contaminated. 6 weeks after the reunion, Fish and Wildlife reported the bears had moved into the deeper wilderness, away from the oil fields. They were behaving normally. Luna was thriving. The attachment to humans seemed to have been replaced by the stronger, proper bond with her mother. Marcus finished his documentation project. His footage of the abandoned oil fields, along with Luna's story, became part of a larger documentary about environmental damage and wildlife resilience. The documentary helped push for cleanup funding for abandoned oil fields across Montana. But that was later. The day Marcus left Montana, he drove by the area one last time. He didn't see the bears, didn't expect to, but he stopped at the spot where he'd found Luna. The pit had been marked with warning tape by Fish and Wildlife, scheduled for cleanup. He stood there, remembering that tiny, oil-covered form, those first moments when her eyes opened. Sarah called him a month later. A motion-triggered camera in the wilderness had captured images of Luna and her mother. Luna was fat and healthy, playing in a stream while her mother fished. She looked like any other wild cub. No trace of her near-death experience, except perhaps a wariness around dark pools of water. She won't remember you, Sarah said gently. Not a good thing. It means she's truly wild again. Marcus knew Sarah was right. Luna forgetting him meant success. It meant she would live as a wild bear should, free and independent. But Marcus would never forget. He carried a photo from that camera trap in his wallet. A healthy brown bear cub splashing in clear water, her mother watching protectively from the bank. The following spring, Marcus received another call from Sarah. A female bear with a cub had been spotted near the rehabilitation center. The mother had a distinctive marking on her ear, a small notch that Luna's mother had. They seemed to be passing through, heading for higher ground as the weather warmed. I thought you'd want to know, Sarah said. She survived winter. They both did. Marcus's documentation work had evolved because of Luna. He started working more closely with wildlife rehabilitation centers, making sure his reports included not just environmental damage, but impact on wildlife. His footage became instrumental in several cleanup efforts. 3 years later, the oil field where he'd found Luna was completely remediated, the land slowly returning to its natural state. He went back there once, 5 years after the rescue. The pits were gone, filled in and covered. Grass had begun to grow. Small trees had been planted. It looked nothing like the wasteland where he'd heard that labored breathing. He spent the day hiking the area, not really expecting anything, but hoping nonetheless. Near sunset, as he was heading back to his truck, he saw them. Two bears in the distance, an adult female and a younger bear, possibly 2 years old. They were too far away to identify certainly, but the older bear had a notch in her ear. They were foraging for berries, the younger bear following the older one's lead, learning. Marcus watched them until they disappeared into the forest. He couldn't be sure it was Luna and her mother. Bears roamed widely, and many had ear injuries. But he chose to believe it was them. He chose to believe that Luna was out there, wild and free, possibly preparing to have cubs of her own someday. The story could have ended differently at so many points. If Marcus hadn't heard that breathing, if he'd been an hour later, if the oil had been deeper in the pit, if Luna's mother hadn't kept searching long past, when most bears would have given up, if the rehabilitation center hadn't been willing to attempt such a risky reunion. But sometimes, against all odds, things work out. Sometimes a dying cub in an oil pit lives to splash in clear mountain streams. Sometimes a grieving mother finds her lost child. Sometimes a man, documenting destruction, becomes part of restoration. Marcus continued his environmental documentation work for many more years. He rescued other animals, birds caught in netting, a fox with its leg caught in abandoned equipment. But none affected him like Luna. She was his first, the one who taught him that documenting damage wasn't enough. You had to be willing to get your hands dirty, to intervene, to save what could be saved. He kept that photo always, the healthy cub in clear water. On difficult days, when the destruction seemed overwhelming, when it felt like nothing he did made a difference, he'd look at it. He'd remember the weight of her in his arms, oil-soaked and barely breathing. He'd remember her eyes opening. He'd remember her running to her mother. Some years later, Marcus was giving a presentation about wildlife impact from industrial abandonment. A young woman in the audience asked how he stayed hopeful when facing such devastation. Marcus pulled out the photo of Luna in the stream. Because sometimes, he said, you find something still breathing in all that destruction. And if it's still breathing, there's still hope. You just have to be willing to reach into the mess and pull it out. The woman nodded, writing something in her notebook. Later, she'd become one of the leading wildlife rehabilitation specialists in the Pacific Northwest. She'd save hundreds of animals. She'd always credit that moment, that photo, that story, as the thing that changed her career path. But Marcus didn't know that yet. All he knew was Luna's story, how a cub waiting for death in an oil pit had lived, had returned to the wild, had reclaimed her life. How a mother's love had persisted against all reason. How sometimes, if you were very lucky, you got to be part of something miraculous. The rehabilitation center Sarah ran expanded over the years, partly due to the publicity from Luna's story. They built better facilities for large mammals. They developed new protocols for reuniting separated wildlife families. Every year, they saved dozens of cubs and successfully returned most of the wild. Sarah always told new volunteers Luna's story, how the cub had been hours from death, how the bond with her rescuer could have doomed her to captivity, how her mother's persistence had saved them both. She'd emphasized that wildlife rehabilitation wasn't just about the individual animal. It was about preserving family bonds, maintaining wild behaviors, ensuring the next generation. The oil company that had abandoned the field where Luna was found was eventually held liable for cleanup costs. The legal process was lengthy, but Marcus's documentation, especially the footage of Luna's rescue, became powerful evidence of the real cost of abandonment. The settlement funded cleanup of dozens of similar sites across 3 states. Environmental lawyers would later say that Luna's story, more than statistics or scientific reports, had swayed public opinion and judicial sentiment. Here was a tangible victim with a face, a story, a miraculous ending that could have easily been tragic. It made abstract environmental damage personal and immediate. Marcus sometimes wondered what Luna's life was like now. Bears in the wild could live 20 years or more. She'd be fully grown, possibly with cubs of her own. Had she taught them to avoid the dark pools that still existed in some places? Did she remember, in some deep part of her bear consciousness, the feeling of being pulled from death? He knew these were romantic thoughts. Bears didn't think like humans. Luna's survival was instinct and luck, not memory and learning in the human sense. But still, he liked to imagine her out there, teaching her cubs to fish in clean streams, to forage for berries, to prepare for winter properly, all the things her mother had retaught her after their reunion. The place where Marcus had found Luna became something of a pilgrimage site for environmental activists and wildlife enthusiasts. A small plaque was eventually placed there. On this site, the rescue of one bear cub led to the restoration of thousands of acres of wilderness. Sometimes saving one life changes everything. Marcus didn't like the plaque. It made him sound heroic when he'd just been doing what anyone should do, helping a dying animal. The real heroes, he always said, were Luna and her mother. Luna for surviving. Her mother for never giving up the search. But the plaque served its purpose. It reminded people that environmental damage had real victims. It inspired others to look closer, to listen for breathing in unlikely places, to be willing to intervene. Several other rescued animals could trace their salvation back to someone who'd read that plaque and decided to check that strange sound or investigate that unusual movement. Years passed. The environmental documentation work Marcus had started evolved into a larger organization. They had teams across the country now, documenting damage, but also coordinating with wildlife rescue organizations. They'd save hundreds of animals caught in the remnants of human industry. Each rescue was documented, the stories told, the pressure for cleanup maintained. Marcus eventually retired from field work, his knees no longer able to handle the rough terrain. He taught others his methods, emphasizing always the importance of listening, of being present enough to notice when something was still breathing in all that destruction. He'd tell Luna's story to new recruits, showing them the photos, the oil-covered cub, the first moments after her eyes opened, the reunion with her mother, and finally, that trail camera image of her playing in the stream. This work is about more than documentation, he'd tell them. Sometimes you're the only chance something has. Be ready. Listen. Don't walk past the breathing. One of his last trips to Montana, 15 years after Luna's rescue, Marcus met an indigenous elder from the Blackfeet Nation. The man had heard Luna's story and wanted to share something. In their tradition, he said, bears were messengers between worlds. A bear saved from death carried special significance. It meant the message was urgent, essential. What was the message? Marcus asked. The elder smiled. That's for you to know. But I think it had something to do with persistence. The cub persisted in breathing. You persisted in cleaning her. Her mother persisted in searching. Together, you persisted in healing. Maybe that's what the earth needs, persistent healing, even when it seems too late. Marcus carried those words with him. Persistent healing. It became the unofficial motto of his organization. Even in the most devastated landscapes, even with animals hours from death, persist in believing healing was possible. The last confirmed sighting of a bear that might have been Luna came 18 years after her rescue. A research team studying bear populations in Montana photographed a mature female with 2 cubs. The female had distinctive scarring on her legs that could have come from chemical burns, the kind oil exposure might cause. She was healthy, her cubs fat and playful. The team sent the photos to Marcus, by then in his 70s. He studied them carefully. The scarring was in the right places. The age was right. The location was within 50 miles of where Luna had been found. It could be her. He chose to believe it was. Those cubs would never know their mother had once lain dying in an oil pit. They'd never know a human had pulled her free, that another bear had searched for weeks refusing to give up, that 2 species had worked together to save one small life. They knew only their mother's warmth, her protection, her teaching, which was exactly as it should be. Marcus died 5 years later, peacefully, at home. Among his effects was a worn photo, a bear cub playing in a clear stream. At his memorial service, Sarah, now also elderly, told Luna's story one more time. How a man documenting disaster had heard breathing where there should have been only death. How he'd reached into the oil and pulled out hope. The organization Marcus founded continued. The oil fields were cleaned up, one by one. Wildlife was rescued, rehabilitated, returned to the wild when possible. Each rescue carried a bit of Luna's story, the reminder that sometimes, against all odds, families could be reunited, lives could be saved, land could be healed. Somewhere in the Montana wilderness, bears continued to fish in clear streams, to teach their cubs to forage, to prepare for winter. Some of them, perhaps, were Luna's descendants, cubs of the cub pulled from the oil. They lived their wild lives unaware of their history, which was the greatest success of all. The pit where Luna nearly died was now covered with grass and wildflowers. In spring, bears sometimes passed through the area, feeding on new growth. No trace remained of the devastation except in photographs, in documentation, in the memories of those who'd been there. But the story persisted. In rehabilitation centers across the country, new volunteers learned about the cub and the mother who'd never stopped searching. In environmental law classes, students studied the case that had changed cleanup requirements. In wildlife biology programs, researchers discussed the successful reunification protocol developed from Luna's case. Most importantly, in the field, people remember to listen, to check strange sounds, to investigate still forms that might be breathing, to reach into the mess and pull out whatever could still be saved. Because sometimes, in the middle of devastation, something survives, something breathes, something waits for someone to hear it, to see it, to believe it can still be saved. That was Luna's true legacy, not just her survival, but the reminder that as long as something is still breathing, there's still time, still hope, still a chance for reunion, for healing, for life to continue despite everything humans had done to make it impossible. The bears don't know this story. They don't need to. They simply live, wild and free in the mountains, fishing in clean streams, teaching their cubs the old ways. But humans know and remember, and because of one oil-covered cub who refused to stop breathing, they continue to reach out, to rescue, to reunite, to restore. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes one saved life really does change everything. Not in grand, dramatic ways, but in small, persistent acts of healing that spread outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. One cub, one rescuer, one searching mother, one successful reunion. Hundreds of other saves that followed. Thousands of acres restored. Countless lives touched by the story of impossible survival and improbable reunion. In the end, that's what mattered. Not the oil or the abandonment or the near death, but the breathing that continued despite it all. The hands that reached out. The mother who never stopped searching. The healing that persisted until it was complete. Luna's story ended as it should have. Not with human intervention, but with wildness reclaimed. Somewhere in Montana, bears fish in streams that run clear. And sometimes, if you know how to listen, you can still hear the breathing that says something survives, something continues, something wild and free persists despite all odds. That breathing was the message. That breathing was the hope. That breathing was the promise that no destruction is final as long as something still draws breath, as long as someone still listens, as long as love, maternal, human, or simply the love of life itself, persists in searching for what was lost. The story spreads still, carried by those who heard it, who tell it, who remember that once a dying cub opened her eyes and lived, who remember that sometimes, if you're willing to reach into the darkness and pull, you might just save something precious. You might just reunite the separated. You might just heal what seemed beyond healing. And in the telling, in the remembering, in the reaching out that continues, Luna lives on. Not just in the Montana wilderness with her own cubs, but in every rescue, every reunion, every moment when someone hears breathing where there should be only silence and chooses to act, to save, to persist in hoping. That's the final truth of Luna's story. It never really ended. It continues every time someone remembers that breathing means hope, that searching might find, that sometimes the lost come home. It continues in clean streams and restored land, and bears teaching cubs the old ways in mountains where oil pits once trapped the unwary. Most of all, it continues in the simple, powerful fact that Luna lived. Against all odds, despite everything, because of persistence and love and refusing to give up, she lived. Wild and free, as bears should be, carrying only the faintest scars of her near death, teaching her own cubs to avoid the dark places, but also, perhaps, teaching them that sometimes help comes from unexpected sources, that sometimes the world conspires to save what should be lost. The Montana wilderness keeps its secrets. Bears move through it like shadows, leaving tracks that fade, living lives humans can only glimpse. But sometimes in those glimpses, we see the proof that our efforts matter. A healthy bear that should have died as a cub. Cubs of her own, strong and wild. Clear streams where oil once pooled. Life persisting, thriving, continuing. That's Luna's gift to the world. The knowledge that it's never too late while something still breathes. The proof that love searches long past logic. The reminder that sometimes, just sometimes, everything works out exactly as it should. A cub returns to her mother. A mother finds her lost child. A man discovers that saving one life can echo through decades. And somewhere in the wilderness, bears fish in clear streams, living their wild lives, free and fierce and perfect, as if they'd never known any other way to be. Tentar Novameni.